So, welcome everybody. I'm Dan Fried, director of the Harvard Center of Mathematical Sciences and Applications, or CMSA. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody. I was hoping to welcome you in person, but it's pretty snowy out there. In any case, that will happen later in the week. The CMSA is a center at Harvard where we bring people together, usually from different parts of mathematics, different parts of mathematics and science. And certainly the group today is one of those groups. I encourage you to find out more about CMSA. You can look on our website, on our YouTube channel. There's a short film on our website. There are newsletters. You'll find them scattered about CMSA when you come in person later this week. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Maha.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome. I can see 24 people online. I'm sorry that, as Dan said, we can't greet you in person. So this is the first week of three associated with the program on mathematics, morphometry, and morphogenesis, as Dan said, hosted at CMSA. Edition one actually happened about 8 years ago, and so very happy to see some people back here and a lot of new people. I want to introduce the co-organizers, Salem Mosley, Vanessa Baroni, Kanchi Munjal, and Olivia Purki, who are all online. And in our first week, we will have a set of tutorial talks starting actually today in just a couple of minutes. And then in the afternoons, typically one or two research talks and also a few shorter research talks by younger participants. And the second and third week, mostly moving towards research talks and hopefully new collaborations. I'm certainly excited by everything that's going to happen in the next 3 weeks. I hope you are too. And I think without much more to say, I'll introduce our first tutorial speaker, Anuj Srivastava, who is just started at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Statistics. If I get the name correct, Anuj will correct me. And he's going to tell us about how to think about statistics geometrically and computationally with morphometry as a guiding light, if I'm allowed to say that. Anuj, over to you.
Thank you very much. First, let's just make sure the system all works correctly. Are you still able to see the slides full screen?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Maha, for inviting me, and I'm equally excited to be part of this program. As Maha mentioned, there was a first sort of previous round of it about 8 years ago. So one of the goals I had in mind for this is to maybe present some progress over the last 8 years. Maha introduced it as a tutorial, which is a very ambitious word to be able to teach a lot in a couple of hours to an audience. So I changed it to an overview, sort of a bird's eye view, and let's see how much we succeed in it. I just moved to Johns Hopkins about a month ago, just before the storm, and I moved from Florida, so the pain is even more for me than usual people, but I'm getting used to it. So you'll see both of my affiliations in the slide just for that reason. Okay, so here is the outline. I have two presentations planned, about an hour each, but I'm hoping there are plenty of interruptions, so I don't end up talking for actual hour. So I want to spend the first part on talking about shapes, representations, mathematical representations, metrics, how to compare shapes. The goal on the first part is more on the applied math side, just to be able to compare shapes. And you will see there is a sort of increasing complexity to the shapes we can handle from what we used to be able to do maybe 8-10 years ago to what we are able to do now. We can handle more and more complex objects as data is becoming more and more complex and available. The second part is my professional affiliation, statistics. So once you have mathematical representations, how to actually do data analysis and what can be done with data analysis from a scientific point of view. How can it aid in different endeavors in scientific discoveries? So that's the general plan, and I'm going to spend the first part on these ideas, shape representations and metrics. So just a brief introduction to my background. I'm a data scientist, but I'm very much interested in scientific applications and certainly look forward to collaborating with people who have such kind of data and are interested in formulations which could lead to some statistical inferences. This talk and the next talks, they are designed for very general audiences. The idea is to show enough examples to motivate the capabilities of what can be done and create some excitement about maybe taking it further. There are some mathematical ideas because I want to distinguish the methods I'm talking about with some other ideas, but certainly if you're a mathematician, this will be very unsatisfactory talk. As I mentioned earlier, it could be very boring if I just talk nonstop for an hour, so please feel free to interrupt in a Zoom fashion, and I will be happy to answer questions. Okay, so just some preliminaries. I'm not familiar with that many names that are participating in this workshop, so I went to ChatGPT to see what do the people who are participating, organizers, what do they do? So, well, that was the first remark I got. What a fascinating set of researchers. So congratulations to the organizers for doing a good job. Now, in terms of what fields they come from, development biology, cell and tissue mechanics, this is at a very high level, and this was mainly for my understanding of what the people are doing, so I can have a talk which is somewhat relatable to these people and the associated audience. So Evo Devo, I mean, I've heard some of these phrases in discussions with people, but I did end up spending some time reading about it and what goes on in these. More specifically, what do these specific participants are doing in these fields? Development and evolution of body plans. That sounds like a very important and long-standing problem. Morphogenesis. I've started listening to a lot of talks in the field. Developmental processes, how to model these things using biomechanics, patterns and shapes, quantitative models and methods to understand biological systems. And also there are people who are developing actual imaging techniques and image analysis technique to image or to learn about these biological systems in a novel way. So that was good learning for me, just half an hour on ChatGPT about what people are doing here. What do? I come from a group or a background where we study shapes. Used to call it Shapes R Us before Toys R Us went out of business, so maybe we need to update this. So we look at a lot of different biological systems, and the goal is, basic undergraduate paradigm that structure determines functionality. And so if we can capture, model, analyze, massage structural representations, we can feed them into some kind of regression models to predict functionality, to correlate functionality, and so on. And we have done that for a number of biological data sets, problem sets that people have brought to us. We have collaborated with, and so I'll be able to show some of these examples live. But that's basically my background in shape analysis, statistical shape analysis. In this particular field, what kind of tools do we develop? Well, first and foremost, we need techniques to be able to compare shapes. So we have objects and they have different shapes, and we want to be able to quantify how they are different, how much they are different, how to quantify it, how to be able to do some sort of a analysis of these shape similarities and differences. We are also beginning to think about dynamical shapes. So we want to be able to represent shape, not only individual shapes, but shape evolutions, and how to model these shape evolutions. So that's the first part. And a lot of different ways exist for doing this, for comparing shapes. Depending on what your interest is, you can do that kind of comparison. The next comes statistical model, and of course we understand there is variability within population and across populations. We want to focus on the variabilities sometimes that distinguishes population and suppress the variabilities within the population, or sometimes it's exactly the opposite. And so how to be able to do that? One should be able to have some sort of a basic statistical paradigm to go with these mathematical representation. So in our toolboxes, we have developed things like how to compute an average shape. You have some shape samples from some population. How to capture the central shape and a variability around it, the typical variability around it. 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation. We know how to do these with numbers and vectors and functions, but how to do it with shapes. So classical techniques brought to the shape arena for doing statistical analysis. Eventually, we want to talk about parametric models, non-parametric models, because not only we want to represent shapes, capture shape variabilities, we want to be able to use this model to derive future inferences. We may be interested in comparing, for example, 2 populations, one in factor 1, another population evolving under factor 2. And we want to be able to compare, is there a statistically significant difference between the 2 evolutions? Lastly, I want to expand on this notion of dynamical shape models. So first part is static shape models, second part is dynamical shape models. So that it brings in more challenges, newer challenges, how to talk about these dynamics. And keep in mind, I'm not a biologist, so I'm not quite thinking from sort of the biological, mechanical point of view. I'm thinking more from a data-driven point of view. Here is the data, how to fit continuous evolutionary trajectories to sort of these sparse measurements, and how to maybe learn some kind of models and complement the efforts that are more biomechanical models and so on. Okay. So these are the kind of toolboxes we bring, and now going back to these different research areas that are associated with people attending this workshop, what can we do to help them? So just as an example, I will just go over 1 or 2 bullets. I don't want to cover all the topics, but let's say morphogenesis. So here people are interested in how shapes are changing and evolving during development periods. And so we can help do that quantification, how to represent shape, how to model mathematically their evolution, and then maybe even help put models, statistical models on this evolution, and even talk about what is a normal evolution, what is an abnormal evolution, how to quantify sort of standard deviations from that. So each one of these topics, ChatGPT helped me figure out how can we help in these different fields. And I was happy to see the use of words like shapes and structures and dynamics and comparisons and modeling scattered throughout the topics that are represented at this workshop. Somewhat surprising to me, but perhaps not surprising to the organizers, because I think they had in mind when they were putting this program together. All right. One more topic about sort of preliminaries, that what is the source of data in these applications? There are many different kinds of imaging techniques. Quite a bit of them are microscopy related. Some are more human scale in CT and MRI. But a lot of this data comes from imaging techniques, which is not surprising. Where we have a lot of non-invasive techniques, and it provides very rich data for understanding the structure part of it. Functionality is, of course, a different arena, but the structure part of it, we have all these different techniques. Sometimes we get images of the object. Sometimes you actually can get the object directly, as, for example, scanned using a scanner, as you see in museums, that data, fossils and those structures. So there are a lot of different techniques which provide images of fascinating information about biological systems. Okay, so what is the entry into this field of data analysis? So we have images, but we want to study structures that are contained in these images. How do we extract these structures? This is often a problem in itself. How do you get a very clean extraction of let's say a cell or a mitochondria or or blood vessel network you see on the right from its images? This was a bigger challenge, but lately there have been fantastic solutions, deep neural networks, learning-based solution. If you have enough of these training data out there, then they are beginning to do job which is remarkably similar to human abilities, the human segmentation. And so this has become less of an issue than it used to be. When I started working in shape analysis, this was my number one concern. Where do we actually get shape data from? Nowadays, we worry less about it. People who are working in the field, who are taking these images, also have developed solutions where they can extract structures. So the bottom line being that for this talk, for my work, for this presentation, we'll assume we have a ways of extracting structures and they are reasonably good. Okay, we'll make that assumption. Of course, we'll run into issues where these structures extracted or even observed have imperfections, and that leads to issues. And I'll try to mention it towards the end, but surely I don't have all the tools to address those imperfections yet. The second problem, looking at the biology literature and how structures are commonly analyzed, is this sort of long-standing technique is to extract some morphological data, morphological features from the original objects. So you get some complex objects. In this case, these are some retinal blood vessel networks. You extract some features of interest and you take statistical analysis to this feature space. So these features, you can just line them up as vectors, pretend they lie in some sort of a Euclidean space, and do this statistical modeling, which is much more traditional. You have multivariate statistics that directly applies and all that. The other, of course, which is more challenging and much more ambitious, is to stay in the space of the objects and do analysis there. Okay, let me see if there is a comment. No, not for me. Okay. So this is a much more challenging idea, is to not extract features but stay in the original object space and do mathematical representations, statistics, decisions in the original space. And the point for doing that is this comparison, that if you look on the left, the features, these are perhaps predefined features, and nowadays deep neural networks define their own features if you give them enough well-defined problem to work with. They are often interpretable features, but most important thing is they are fast. They're the standard traditional statistical tools apply, and one doesn't have to do too much new advancement. The problem in using these representation is we lose information. So for example, if we go back to this idea that we have this network of blood vessels, we extract some features, and I'll mention these features. For example, here, one of my students, he would extract this list of features, total number of nodes, degrees of freedoms, lengths, and tortuosity, and so on and so forth. The issue is you can extract the features rather easily, but you cannot go back from these feature vectors to the original object, which means some information is lost. You can even imagine there's a whole equivalence class of objects which lead to the same exact feature representation. And it's important to understand that. There is a lot of interest in topological data analysis where people extract topological features. And a similar question is being raised there too, is what different objects in the original object space lead to exactly same topological features in the sense that they are indistinguishable. Okay. The object-oriented approach is fully invertible. We remain in the original object space. We do statistical analysis. Even if we represent these objects with certain features, we can go back. So if you have a number of objects and we are interested in computing, let's say, an average shape, we can extract the features from these objects, calculate the average of these features, and map this average vector back to the object space and visualize and understand in what sense was this averaging done, right? So this is an important distinction, and as I mentioned, our interest is in staying in the object space. Hi, Maha, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question here in the context of what you said about invertibility. I mean, my thought is that object-oriented and object-centered approaches would still have a scale-dependent aspect to them, because you presumably have some kind of filter right at the get-go when you first pull out data. You know, if your data is visual, you have a characteristic scale below which you cannot resolve anything associated with the microscope and so on and so forth. And similarly, as you analyze the data, even using a Riemannian geometric approach, presumably you have some smoothness criteria, and those smoothness criteria automatically build in resolution. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think so. I think my statement restated is that we will retain the resolution at which the data was given up to these choices of metrics and representations and the resolutions we want to handle, right? If we want to handle at higher resolution, higher scale, with some computational cost, these methods will allow you to do it. So it is a choice in the end. You will see we have tools to sort of zoom out and zoom back in as needed, paying the cost for handling the complexity and scale. Okay, that's a good point. All right. So moving on, getting more specific, what is the nature of
Can I ask
data?
a question?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So now you specify these features, but assume basically you don't know what are the minimal set of features that this image needs to be classified. What's the state of the art in having techniques that tell you, okay, the minimum representation of this complex object is n-dimensional, or wherever n is, and what are these sort of low-dimensional variables? Is there anything that gives you that without imposing the variables?
This is a deeper question and a very important question. And in a specific context, there are answers. So if you say all I want to do is classify images, then you can feed it in the neural networks and it will get you an acceptable level of performance. What we are doing is different. So what we are doing is we keep the objects in their native space. So in some sense, we are overdoing sometimes, because maybe we don't need the whole structure to solve a particular classification problem, right? But we are keeping all the information to be able to do as many problems downstream, not necessarily a specific classification problem, right? So you will see in my analysis that we will visualize all the structures in their native space. No features are extracted in an abstract sense, right? I will actually show you the original objects. I'll show you the inferences that we derive and all the different things in the original space. So your question is very valid. I don't know if I have an answer to that, except that we keep all the information and maybe we are overdoing it in the hope that you don't know what is needed down the line for different problems, right?
Okay.
All right, so now looking at different kinds of data structures, getting into mathematical representation, we get data in many different forms. Sometimes we just have set of points, point clouds. Sometimes these point clouds are labeled. Each point has a meaning and has some distinction. Moving on to something more continuous, we may have contours of objects in images, so we get curves, these boundaries. We have worked with these bioinformatics, biological proteins and complex structures, chromosomes and RNAs. We have 3D objects. We focus on their surfaces. So we have brain structures, skulls, vertebra, and so on. Getting more complex, we have structures which are not just simple curves. They have branching structures with unknown number of branches and size of branches and so on and so forth. So we actually have these botanical trees. We have studied neurons, neuromorphology. That's a huge field in its own, taking data from neuromorpho. And then in the bottom, we have structures which are mathematically not just simply branching, but also they branch and connect and they form graphs. So we call them shape graphs. And some of the examples are these retinal blood vessels in eyes, so oximetry data, images. And so we are working with a group on studying the shape of retinal blood vessels for studying, for example, glaucoma. Now in the bottom right, I have written a small block of like imperfect objects. So these are all sort of pristine in some sense, that we got, somebody have worked hard and gave us great data. But suppose we have skulls with missing parts, broken pieces, and some more holes than biologically justified. And so one has to deal with all of that too. In this talk, in this presentation, I'm not dealing with that. I'm assuming we have the right topologies, the right representations for the data. There is no sort of missing parts, broken parts, and so on. Okay. How do we start doing shape analysis? We go back to the very starting idea, the original idea. It's relatively simple in the hindsight, but mathematically and statistically very mature field, originated by David Kendall, Sir David Kendall in England, 1980s, and a whole stream of work after that, which has led to a lot of statistical tools for analyzing that data. He perhaps one of the earliest one to mathematically formalize, although I sort of argue that Ulf Trenander did quite a bit of it, and many other people did in parallel. But his notion of shape, as he stated in his 1984 paper, that shape is a property that is left after we have removed certain transformations. And these transformations, he thus called them shape-preserving transformation. So let's get into it a little bit. Going back to our high school geometry, we used to study triangle. Maybe it's been done in middle school nowadays. Who knows? Things are accelerating in the high school level. So we used to call congruent objects. If you take two triangles and just simply rotate and translate them, the angles and the lengths of the sides remains the same. But the next came similar objects, where you are even allowed to scale the object. You can multiply all the sides by the single same constant. So you can zoom in and zoom out, so to speak, these objects, and these were called similarities, similar triangles. And that's the notion that David Kendall developed, where if you have objects that can be rotated, translated, and scaled into each other, then we'll deem them similar in shapes. So it's not that new a notion. We have seen this in high school geometry long time ago. So just to do a little bit more mathematics precisely, let's suppose we have an object which is represented by k points or k landmarks, each one of them in Rn. We can organize this data in form of k columns. Each column has length n. So it's a matrix, n by k matrix. And since we are not interested in the location, scale, the size, and rotation, orientation of these objects, we get rid of these transformations by doing certain things. So we center this object by subtracting the average location of landmarks, and we get a slightly reduced representation. Then we take the resulting matrix and just simply scale it by its Frobenius norm to get rid of the size of the object. And so far so good. But now we also want to remove the orientation, the rotation. If we have two objects with different rotations, we want to be impervious to these transformations. So what we do is we take these two matrices and align them in a Procrustes sense, fix one and rotate the other to minimize certain norm, and we have a closed form expression for that. Something interesting has happened in this simple formulation, that for centering and scaling, I could just do some transformation and be done with them. But when it comes to rotational alignment, I have to do it always pairwise. I have to take two shapes and align one to another. There is no sort of a global orientation. I could just put everybody in that coordinate frame and be done with rotation, just like I was able to remove translation and scaling. Once we do that, then in the remaining space, which is some sort of a quotient space, I'll mention it in a minute, we can compute these shortest paths, which were called geodesics, and they help us show how to transform one shape into another through a sequence of shapes, which sometimes provide interpretations. Maybe if you have multiple choices of metrics and multiple ways of doing it, visualizing them may help as one being a better way, better physically, biologically plausible than other. This Kendall's approach, although is rather simple.
I think there's a question,
Go
Anuj.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Vanessa.
And I wanted to ask you on your previous slide, this is, I am assuming that you need to do these calculations for each of the points in this little skeleton?
No,
Is that correct?
this is done as a matrix. So X is a matrix of all the points. There are K points in Rn. So this matrix X represents the whole skeleton. And if you have two skeletons, X and Y, you do a single rotation of one of the skeletons to align with another. And there is a formula for computing this, which does it as the whole skeleton as a set by itself.
All right.
So yeah.
And so how far can you bring something like this? Like how many points can you handle in a system like this?
Well, I mean, it's up to you and your computer. This is a closed form formula for doing this. Nothing too expensive, very standard, millions, no problem, gazillions maybe, But you will see us doing more than just these skeletons with points. We are going to move on to continuous objects, which has in principle infinitely many points. So we'll deal with that too, and we deal with it very, very well. So
thank you.
All right, good question. So this Kendall's approach helps us formalize these options, this approach to shape analysis, which generalizes to many other methods. So this whole field of shape analysis, you will hear this terminology quite often. Firstly, the transformations that we want to get rid of it, they are groups, they form group actions. So for example, if you rotate an object and then rotate again, then you can compose these rotations to get one big rotation. So that's very convenient. That's very nice. Mathematically, it gives us ways to compose things, right? Then there is a notion of orbits, so sort of equivalence classes. If you take an object and apply all possible rotations to it, then all these objects you get, they have the same shape. And so they form these orbits or equivalence class. And the shape space is nothing but the set of such equivalence classes, often called an orbit, a set of orbits. Now the picture on right is very important. That's certainly when I was working with shape analysis and my mathematics colleague explained it to me, it illuminated a lot in my mind. The point of this picture is that I showed you this previous calculation where we had two skeletons, X and Y, and I rotated Y to align with X. And in this picture, what that meant is that I have two orbits, one associated with all possible rotations of Y, one associated with all possible rotations of X, and you can fix X and rotate Y to align with X, or you can fix Y to rotate X to align with Y. In either way, it gives you the same solution, right? Why is that? How is it that we are able to do this rather sort of nonchalantly rather than carefully? Because the choice of metric for this alignment was the Euclidean norm, and the Euclidean norm has this property that if you take two skeletons and rotate them by the same rotation, their norm, this distance, doesn't change. And so loosely speaking, it means that these two orbits, these two vertical lines are parallel. So if you take two objects, one point on this line, one point on this line, and rotate them by the same amount, they will still remain the same distance. And so loosely speaking, these orbits are parallel. So you can fix any point on the first orbit and find the nearest point on the second orbit. And therefore, you could just get away with just single rotation. You don't have to search over both rotations. But what if these orbits were not parallel? Suppose they were coming towards each other. The distances were changing. We could not do this. And it's quite possible that they may even intersect. So we may find some rotations where the distance between them is zero. It's hard to imagine this for these sort of skeletons and 3D rotations, but I'm making a point that actually comes up in functional data analysis when we start talking about curves and surfaces. Right? Okay, but before I get to this, there is a whole sort of...
Excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry, there's a lot of noise around me. Does the scaling cause a problem with doing this?
Yes, scaling does cause a problem, but for scaling, there is actually a metric which has invariant, which is called a scaling invariant metric just by itself. Right, so scaling is a slightly different beast, but for that, there is a very nice solution that under that metric, the orbits are parallel. Right, so scaling is still fine, although it doesn't appear to be that under Euclidean norm. Right. So let me walk you through this graph in shape analysis. Very often what we'll see this structure that we'll start with some sort of mathematical representation of shape, and we'll say here is a group we want to get rid of. You already seen rotation, translation, scale, but we'll see many more groups, diffeomorphism groups and permutation groups and so on and so forth. In each case, we are going to ask this sort of question: is there a metric which is invariant under this group action? Just like the Euclidean norm was invariant under rotation, right? If the answer is yes, sorry, where am I? Then there is a further more sophisticated question to be asked. I'm not going to be able to explain it that quickly, but is there some sort of a nicer subset where you can just boil all your calculation, restrict all your calculation to that set? And if the answer to that is yes, then you are golden. Then you can do things without worrying, willy-nilly, just go ahead and do it. And turns out scales, translations, and permutations, they fall into that. But if it doesn't admit an orthogonal section, then what you have to do is, for example, align them pairwise. And rotation falls under that category. You cannot just pre-rotate everything. You have to rotate them two at a time, pairwise at a time, right? And
Anish,
it will turn out.
Can I ask, like, how do you determine that? I mean, I think I get the sense, right?
Yeah.
If you have a 3D object or through two 3D objects, you're going to find a point in the middle, so you can only deal with the 2D aspects of it. Am I getting this correctly?
No, not quite. Let me get to the 3D objects, and maybe this question gets answered. So
Anuj, can I ask another question here?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
If I have noisy data,
yeah,
from the get-go, I may not know exactly whether the group representation is relevant and valid for that data. I'll have to filter it first so that I get an approximate invariance.
Yes.
So are there
Yes.
ways of generalizing these notions of groups to groupoids, or slightly more restricted versions of invariance, or a statistical version of invariance rather than a deterministic version of invariance?
I haven't thought about it. Perhaps there is, but I think you are pointing to something which we have better understanding on, that even if you don't have, let's say you have group invariant metrics and group representation for the ideal data, pristine data, but when you get noisy data, you can handle it with statistical models on these spaces rather than handling them in the representation state itself.
But if you wanted to work with the statistical representation, you have to know how to filter it, or you have to know how to average it effectively.
Yes, how to mathematically model the noise, how to statistically model the noise. Yeah. So we sort of postpone that question by first having these mathematical representation, then we put the sort of probabilistic superstructures on top of it. Right?
But do they commute?
Often not. It's a very sequential process. So you sort of can go back and forth in the sense that you say, this didn't do a good job. I assumed a noise model. This was not the correct noise model. And you sort of either improve your mathematical representation or you improve the statistical model. They don't sort of commute. I think this is X comes first and probability of X comes later, right? You define the space and then you define distribution on that space. But if that distribution is not good enough or mathematical representation is not, you're back to the drawing board.
Okay.
Sequentially, one step at a time. Just to sort of finish this thought, if there is no invariant metric, and there are a lot of scenarios in shape analysis. So for example, some people want to be invariant. And Ma, you mentioned filtering. So I worked on a problem where we wanted to be comparing images irrespective of how blurry they are. And it turned out there was no really nice metric we could come up with. And so then we had some solutions, but nothing as pretty as the ones on the right. So it's sort of you select a section in some way, somewhat arbitrary way, and work with it. I mentioned it's a wild, wild west. Everybody has their choice, and then there's no sort of comparing things. Just go with the choices. Okay, so I want to move on to the continuous objects just to be maybe able to help with Vanessa's question. So we start with curves. So the question is, how do we compare shapes of these things that you see on the screen? And I'm thinking of them as parametrized curves, not just as a discrete set of points. I have a parametrization. Okay. And so we can do what we did with the skeleton, which was a set of points. We can start with this parametrized curve. 0, 1 is the parameter. We can center these curves. We can scale these curves. And we can rotationally align these curves, right? The question is this enough? The part that is missing when it comes to doing shape analysis of curves is the registration. There is yet another group of freedom that we have to play with, is which part on one curve, which point on one curve should be matched with which point on the second curve. And I'm talking dense registration. Every point should have either something on the other side or be declared that there is nothing on the other side. So this registration is even more bigger problem and is yet another group. And the way we handle it is via this reparameterization group. So suppose we have these two curves, and we want F1 and F2, and we want to figure out which point on the first curve matches with which point on the second curve. We parameterize the first curve by t, F1 of t, and on the second curve, we parameterize it with F2 of t, but reparameterize it with gamma. So it becomes F2 of gamma of t. So gamma is this reparameterization function, which is controlling which point is going from one curve to the other. But as we know, parameterization of curves are arbitrary. They don't change the shape. Parameterization is simply at what speed are you walking along the curve. So that's another shape-preserving group that Kendall didn't consider, because Kendall was thinking about discrete points. But when you go to continuous curve, you have to worry about how to mod out this additional nuisance variability. And so here is one more picture of sort of explaining the benefits of registration. I have these two scalar functions, F1 and F2. And if I just simply interpolate between them vertically using just vertical registration, then the interpolated curves look like this. But if I solve for the best registration between the blue and the red, and then interpolate between them, they preserve the structure better. And that's the point of shape analysis, is we have to focus on the shapes of the curves rather than the given parameterizations. Okay. Again, the question is how to solve for the best reparameterization. I want to register F1 with F2 using the best gamma. The question is, what should be the metric that should be used to define the best gamma, best registration? The first thing that comes to mind, functional data analysis, statistics, is L2 norm. Turns out that is degenerate. This is a surprising thing. It doesn't simply go from, we think about Fourier analysis, Parseval's theorem, L2 norm in finite goes to L2 norm in continuity. This particular optimization is degenerate. So what people have done for decades is added penalties to this in order to stabilize it. But that has some other problems. The fundamental problem is this, that this L2 norm is not invariant to this group action, this reparameterization. So whatever you do, you cannot fix this. You can sort of put penalties and here and there and stabilize, but you cannot fix. So the question is, going back to this chart, is there an invariant metric for this particular group action which can be used to register curves? And the answer is yes, and I'll rather go fast on it, but there is a fantastic history for those like me who come from statistics. Rather stalwarts of statistics, Fisher and Rao derived certain metric. They did it for some finite dimensional cases. There's a whole field of information geometry based on this particular metric. What we do is a non-parametric form. So for the people who are familiar with these distinctions, they can probably relate to that. So getting back to our problem of shape analysis, we have this metric which has the nice invariant property, but is somewhat complicated to use. So way back, this is beginning to sound like old people, but very early when we started working with shape analysis, we derived a transformation where you take a curve and transform it into another curve representation, which is called square root velocity function. I'll represent it with Q, which has this property that it takes this complicated metric and converts it into L2 norm between two functions. So it takes a very nonlinear analysis and simplifies it into standard linear functional data analysis. So, and then of course this invariance holds that if you take two curves and compare their SRVFs with this L2 norm, this norm does not change if you reparameterize them with the sim diffeomorphism. Pictorially, it means we are back to parallel orbits. And now I can do this problem where I can fix one of the curve and reparameterize the second curve optimally by minimizing this, just like we would do for rotations. We'll fix one skeleton and best rotate the other skeleton. Now we can fix one curve and best reparameterize using this formulation, and it gives us the best registration across the curve. And so as a side output, these are just scalar functions. I'm not there to curve shapes of curves yet, but we have this simple little 10-line MATLAB code where you give me these unaligned functions and I can time warp them and align them and give you the time warping. Fully automatic, no penalties, no tuning, no human intervention. So look at this middle row where these were the input functions, where it was not even clear which peak should match with which peak. But the program does a fantastic job. And this was about 15 years ago, and it still stands in the field as the best way of aligning scalar functions. We have extended it to curves in R2, but I will run out of time, so I will not be able to explain. I had some insights into what this SRVF, how did we come about, which did it. For people like Maha, this has very nice mathematical and even physical interpretations. This remark that a curve is represented by a speed function along the curve and an angle function. And we put a Riemannian metric on the speed part, which is related to stretching or bending the curve, and the angle part, which relates to rotating this curve infinitesimally. And some weighted sum of these measurements becomes the Riemannian metric that we use, and the square root velocity function is some combination of this with the square root imposed on the speed part, and that's why we call it square root velocity function. In that this complicated metric becomes a simple L2 inner product under
Anuj,
this transformation. Go ahead. Yes.
Could I ask a question? Maybe I'm obsessing too much about the role of noise. L2 is a bad way to deal with noise because it essentially says that all noise is equal.
Yes.
But if you use L2, then you're saying that the square root velocity transformation makes sure through the Fisher-Rao that you have a properly registration invariant norm metric.
Yes.
If I switched from L2 to L1 or L0 in the spirit of thinking about compressed sensing and sparse representation, is there an analogous set of theorems associated with how would you replace the SRVF with some other renormalized version of your curve?
We don't. Those metrics are well known not to be invariant under the reparameterization, the diffeomorphism groups. And so therefore, in fact, there is work in the opposite direction where I'm involving the first derivative of the curve, but if you involve second and third and higher order derivatives, then there are a solution. But that's the bad direction because the noise gets even more enhanced.
Worse. Because if you take derivatives, it just makes it worse and worse. So is there an integrated version rather than a differentiated version of your curve, which is smoother.
One can do that. One can just simply do that. Suppose, there are some examples where we got the data, which represented some sort of PDFs, but we wanted to work with CDF. So we just simply integrated the data and we applied this technique to that, right? You can smooth the data, then apply this. You can integrate. So you can do some convenient transformation and then follow it up with this.
But the problem with integration is that you can basically just add arbitrary constants, and that becomes problematic because now you've lost that invariance that you had previously.
Yeah. So one has to be aware of same thing with sort of smoothing, like how much smoothing you do to the data. We have sort of, in some sense, perturbed the data. We are no longer invariant to those prior, pre-processings that we are doing. So, but do whatever is needed for the nature of the problem, and then bring this tool. That would be. So I have in our book, we study noisy data by smoothing functions, and then we applying, and we study like the different level of noises.
Okay, but is there an optimal amount of smoothing? For example, just like you have to use dynamic programming to determine this optimal warping function.
That's a separate question. Yeah, one may perhaps, if smoothing can be posed as it's a semi-group, you can sort of convolve and deconvolve.
Yes.
And so one can pose this sort of question, but this falls on the left side of my picture, which was, I said, the wild west. You sort of pick a certain. I can help you come up with a constant so that all the data will have the same level of smoothing. I have a way to quantify, which is same as we are saying I have a way to section these orbits. But one can do this slightly differently in different contexts, and it's not clear if we have universal answers. All right, so moving on. I'm going to go fast because I'm coming up on the end of my time. Here are some pictures to show that we can compute geodesics between objects while solving for the registration. Getting onto the 3D objects, again, there is some good mathematics and a whole new book we have written about it, but I'm just going to again get to the illustrations. And so just like there is a notion of square root velocity function for curves, there is some similar notion, but not quite as satisfactory. Something is lost in the process. So we have an embedded, a parametrized surface, parameterized by, let's say, points on a sphere. There are these geometrical quantities. You can compute sort of gradient vector fields on the surface. There's the first fundamental form, or the induced Riemannian metric on sphere from the surface. And there is the normal vector field at each point. If you take these two gradient vector field, take the cross, you get a normal vector field. You can normalize the normal vector field to make it a unit normal vector field. So what we are going to do for the purpose of shape analysis, we are going to represent a surface not in the original parametrized form, but by this pair, which is the first fundamental form and a normal, G, N. So that's what we do, G, N. And in that representation, there is the most general form of elastic Riemannian metric, which doesn't involve higher order derivatives. One can always go higher. But up to first order, up to first fundamental form, there is a metric which has the right invariance to this reparameterization, right? Just like we had for curves, just like Fisher and Rao had it for PDFs long time ago. The problem is, again, this metric is somewhat complicated to work with, and so we derived something called a square root normal field, which unfortunately takes into account only these two terms, not the third term. And that's a discussion I think we should have, Maha, some other time, because there are these interpretations associated with each one of the terms. What is it measuring? And when we drop the term, what did we lose? But for these remaining two terms, there is this formula which converts this complicated metric to back into L2 norm. And we can go about doing things in a sort of same way. Go ahead.
How do you choose lambda and eta?
So this is a particular form of lambda and eta that gives us this. So we pick up one element of the family. So there is a whole family of these nonlinear metrics, but one element of it can be flattened. I think lambda is 1/4 and eta is 1, some combination. And later on, people have generalized it. They can handle general lambda and eta, but with not as much simplicity as we got, with somewhat combined. But again, we are back to invariant metric and registration. And so these are examples of geodesics. So Vanessa, returning to your question, 3D objects, we think of them as parametrized surfaces. We solve for what is the best dense registration between points across surfaces. And then we compute as an object in this object space what is the shortest path between them. Visually, it appears as if that's the best deformation to go from one object to another. And we are able to do this with quite complex objects. I'm thinking I have to stop in about 3 minutes. So I'm just going to flash a few more things. And in fact, I will start not from talk 2, I'll start from part of this when I start again in half an hour. But we have been able to do with these things with not just curves and nice surfaces, but objects which are branching structures. And I just want to show these pictures because they are beautiful in themselves. Forget the math, forget the science. These are beautiful renderings of deforming a tree into another tree. These are real trees, 3D laser scan trees, leaf to leaf, element to element registered. And this was an example of a small tree. This is a geodesic between that small tree and a large tree. Sort of, this is not biological growth, and if we stare at it long enough, there are many things wrong with this biologically. But it provides us with a tool for comparing, quantifying, and deforming objects into each other. And we have done this. Maha, go ahead.
How do you guarantee that you do not violate the topological constraints, for example, over here associated with the adjacency?
So that's part of the process. But I mean, we do violate a whole lot of things in this, if you look at it. But there are so the mathematics here is that we have a main branch Q0, and then we have side branches. So we have a main branch, side branch, and main branch is reparametrized to match with main branch, right? Side branches are matched with side branches, and they are reparametrized with their matching side branch. So we have this sort of local diffeomorphism branch by branch registering. But something bad does happen in this, that we have two branches and they may just slide past each other. And that's certainly a no-no. So perhaps one can put more constraint on it, but we deal with it in a different way. We are just dealing with it as a simple tool for computing geodesics between the objects. And then we have done this for graphs also. If somebody is interested, I can talk more about it. But this brings in an additional, yet another group, which is the permutation group. You have graphs and nodes, and you don't know which node and which edge should be matched with. So that's yet another layer on top of it. So we have the metric, which is invariant metric. So we can, again, the orbits are parallel. We can solve for this. It's an NP-hard problem, so we have approximation. We even have a neural network solving this registration problem. And so one can do this. So far I have talked about static shapes. Maybe next in half an hour when I start, I want to start talking about how shapes changing over time. But certainly ran out of shape, and I don't want to violate the coffee break constraints. So definitely I'll stop here. Maybe if there are questions I can answer, but I'll let the organizers take over at this stage. Thank you. So if there are no questions, I will just unshare this and...
The questions, there are a lot of people who are also attending. I presume that they can ask questions, not just the 10 people who are on the panel. Vanessa, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say the same thing, that maybe we should invite questions from the participants if anyone wants to either say something or put it in the chat.
Anuj, may I make a request at the end of the second talk, if you have, or some other time this week, if you can put some references for people to follow up.
Yes.
And you said that there are some codes which people can use. So if that's
Yes.
possible, I think that might be enormously useful for
I started doing it this morning, so it's the end of the second
No
talk.
problem.
I have some references, maybe a little too late, but good point. I will try to do as much more
Thank
I
you.
can. Yeah, thanks.
Nuj, I have a question about you kind of addressed this, but like the uniqueness of the metric that you get. For example, even if you have discrete set of points, you're starting from a Euclidean metric, and then from there you get to a shape invariant metric. Is it like whether you're talking about discrete points or a curve? Like, is there like it's a very natural choice that you arrive at, but is it unique in some sense?
Yes. So, I mean, so let me just parse your question. One starts with the metric on the original representation. And in this case, set of landmarks are presented by a matrix, and we simply chose the L2 norm as between the matrices. And one of the reasons for choosing that was that it is an invariant metric under the group we want to get rid of, which is rotation, right? So we start with a metric and we call the pre-shape space or the upper space, and it induces a metric in this quotient space. And if this group action is invariant, then you inherit, this induces a metric between the orbits, right? And that becomes our shape metric. So the question is which metric to use is in the upper space. Certainly it should be a metric that has right invariance property so that we can induce it down. But there might be many such choices, right? Even in our family of metrics, if you change the weights, you get different metrics. So right now we just went by convenience, whichever one gave us the simplest solution downstairs. But one can again do some statistics and see with experts which solutions make more sense. But the bare necessity for us is to choose a metric in the upper space which is invariant to group action. Otherwise, we are on the left side where less, I think the sort of shape analysis, traditional shape analysis breaks apart. Everybody's on their own after that. Thank you.